On the rare occasions where the television worked, I would watch television shows like The Dukes of Hazzard and The A-Team. You know, kitschy, over the top action adventures that whiled away the evening hours. And this was only when the television worked. But I did grow up with the old episodes of Star Trek, and those to this day still occupy my imagination with extreme fond memories. Even the cheap special effects. I have more appreciation for the cheap, cheesy special effects because they just seem to have an honesty to them that high dollar CGI special effects seem to pretend to have but don't really have. There's an awful lot of design work and composition work and research gone into plugging in numbers into a computer, and it's not to diminish the skill in creating these vast tapestries of CGI greatness. It's just there's a tangibility to practical effects, cheesy or not. It lends a little bit of weight to the story. And Star Trek was one of those stories that had a significant amount of weight to them. And there were other franchises that I loved. Obviously, the Road Warrior, Mad Max. They're off kilter B movies, and more often than not, I have an awful lot of more fondness for cheesy B movies than I do for mainstream blockbusters. Uh, One of the early '90s Hardware. I can't remember right off the top of my head the guy who directed it, but it was just a inexpensive science fiction post-apocalyptic movie, and it was obviously the special effects were what they were, but it was the atmosphere that the movie seemed to excel at. The same kind of atmosphere that Mad Max seemed to excel with, that so many movies with much higher budgets, they just don't seem to. It's like buying popularity. You can try to buy popularity, but or influence, but unless it's naturally there, you know, money doesn't. I guess money doesn't get you happiness. There's just a peculiar flavor to cheap B movies that blockbusters don't have. Anyway, one of the one of the biggest issues I always had with Star Trek was this magic box that always seemed to have food and drink. This what I would find later on to be uh, the utopian idea of post scarcity, and I think it's a fantasy, perhaps not, but it was one of those things that didn't lend too much reality to the idea of having this magic box that would just, it's like a genie, a magical digital genie that you just touched a button and it would come up with what you wished for. And I would assume that space, the space frontier would be instant death. It's not like the rambling savanna or the rambling fields of grass during the western expansion of the United States, where if you got shot with an arrow, you could sit there and bleed out for hours and hours and hours, or you would, if without water or without food, you could just drift off into the wilderness and gradually wither away. With space, it's sudden death. There's no sitting there waiting to rot away. It's sudden death, and it's one of the biggest issues I have with the latest franchise of Star Trek, the movies, is there's no impact. You see these lasers coming out and shooting the side of the ship, and the ship blows up, and you see these bodies, but there's no context with the bodies. They're just mannequins flying out of space. And there's no, I would imagine that you're a crew on a ship, and their personal relationships. It's not like, crewmen are screwing crewwomen and having canoodles in the closet, so to speak, but they're like personal relationships and interactions with crew members, and they have to work like a tight unit. And I would imagine that there would be some post-traumatic impact on a person's mind if they saw one of their crewmates being sucked out into space. That's that kind of like automatic emotional impact. And I imagine, a ship in combat, you'd have to like sideline these emotions for the moment, but it seems kind of vastly superficial. And that was the other thing about the original Star Trek, that even Next Generation, there was that significance in the characters themselves that the movies after Star Trek 6, and I think after the sixth Star Trek movie, it was kind of just running on its own inertia. But it doesn't matter. The biggest thing is the the video being played here is a compositional exercise to a long-standing science fiction anthology. One of my memory's shit right now. I probably could look it up, but I'm being lazy. There was a manga sci-fi anthology called 2001 Nights, and I obsessed over that just as much as I obsessed over the Crazy Cat book. And then there was obviously Katsuhiro Otomo, who did Akira. These two things were like major influences in my artwork. While lots of influences could be with X-Men and DC Comics, and I was more of a DC Comics kind of person. I liked the artwork in X-Men more than the artwork in the DC Comics, but I liked the storylines more with DC. And then in being introduced to Dark Horse Comics and Sin City, and then that was it. The three major influences, apart from Crazy Cat, the three major influences to my comic book work was those two Japanese artists and Frank Miller. Frank Miller's Sin City. That was visual paradise. Grit. It was a balance between grit and detail and absolute, just the bare minimum, the ragged edge between the bare minimum of visual impact. But the idea in these stories that I'm working on is bringing home the idea that there's almost a level of desperation that if you don't do this, you die. If you don't accomplish that, you die. If you don't get that done, you die. There's an immediacy to the death, too. It's not like I'll die like in a week. I'll die of sepsis. I'll die of gangrene. I'll have to have my leg taken off, and that'll be that. It's just the idea of instant, sudden death. And that's one of the things that would be worked on with this. So, anyway, thanks for watching.